Transforming Relationships. I'm your co-host, Dr. Eric Spiegel, and with me, my other co-host, Dr. David Alter, who's here to share with all of you a little bit about our show today. Hi, David.
Eric, great to see you again. Hello, everyone. I'm David Alter, Dr. David Alter, and as Eric said, his partner in crime on transforming relationships. So we want to talk with you about what's going on outside the window of our homes. Anywhere you look, any headline you read, any news broadcast you listen to, it seems absolutely saturated with messages that in one way or another convey the idea that we're coming apart at the seams. I don't know about you, but the level of anxiety and uncertainty and fear seems to be growing, no matter whether you come at it from a right of center position or a left of center position. And it's really concerning as a psychologist to see how much divisiveness and polarization is everywhere that I see, certainly in my office every single day. Are you getting that as well, Eric?
Absolutely, David. And you know, as you were giving that intro, I was thinking that if we didn't say anything specific about current events, this is probably something that if people were going back with us in a time machine and watching this 4 years ago, it would be relevant. And if they're going in a time machine 4 years into the future, it would be relevant. Right. There's something about these times. And yes, I'm having that same experience of people feeling really distrustful and afraid. And, it's almost like you don't pay attention to the content of what they're distrustful and afraid of. You just listen to the ways that they're distrustful and afraid. Yeah. And it's universal. And maybe that would actually be a really good place, David, for you to begin with sort of explaining to people what is the underpinning of that fear.
We overemphasize, I think, what people say and what they think, and we don't recognize that we're actually picking up, almost like the weather, the barometric pressure. There's something in the air that conveys to us at a very, very deep level whether we are in a safe environment or a threatening environment. And the way in which that profoundly acts like a filter to shape what we can take in, what we see, what we hear, what we feel, I think we underestimate how powerful that is. Let me give you an example of a poll result that was taken just a few years ago. People on the left were asked, if you had a choice between re-electing the current administration or having a meteor hit the Earth that would instantly devastate 60% of all life on Earth, what would you choose? And more than 50% of the people, in fact, I think it's more than 60% of the people said, I would choose the meteor. And you know what? If you ask people on the right of center, if you knew that the new administration was going to come in from the left, or you could choose having a meteor hit the Earth that would devastate 60-70% of life on Earth, what would you choose? And people on the right said, oh, I would choose the meteor. So how illogical, how irrational that is, how it illustrates that it's not just people that we disagree with. We've transformed the people that we disagree with into monsters that we live in terror of, that we think we have to destroy, even if it destroys ourselves, rather than allow them to have a place in the world. Think of how scary the implications of that are. And again, that's true across the spectrum of current social beliefs. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I found myself both trying to identify with somebody who's taking that poll and what they're feeling, and also trying to imagine, and look, this is a show about relationships, so we look at all kinds of relationships, trying to imagine how sadly certain people are very well positioned to utilize that fear to advance their aims. Because, what's at the core of that poll, David? The core of that poll is someone saying it would be better to have a mass extinction event, but know that we could start over again, preserving the way of life that I believe is so essential, and wiping out, the way of my opponent,
Mhm.
than to dare proceed with the social experiment of letting them advance their beliefs. So we've really been taught that this is life or death. It's high stakes. And unfortunately, that then situates people who are well positioned, charlatans, to kind of take advantage of fear, to
Mhm.
really use these messages that further divide people. And so, I believe in I'm curious to hear what you're going to say, that one of the reasons that you introduced this poll was to talk about this moment of vulnerability.
Mhm.
But when there is vulnerability, there are also people that take advantage of the vulnerable. And so
Yeah.
you have all of that.
We have all of that going on, and I think that's a major driver of what you and I are co-creating here. When there is an epidemic of disconnection, of isolation, of loneliness, people will look and be strongly motivated to find people who look just like themselves, think just like themselves, act just like themselves. We circle the psychological wagons, and anyone outside that circle is perceived as a threat, is perceived as a source of danger. So it accelerates this movement away from each other. It's like on our country lives on either side of a river with this massive drawbridge in the middle. And in this context, both sides pull up the drawbridge, so we become isolated, and we will then guard against anyone trying to come across that river. That's the threat. We can only be safe if we stay with our own kind. That's not an attitude that has anything to do with a healthy community. Community is all about diversity, tolerance, interaction, collaboration. And I think in our work together, every single day, we're working to build the skills around which connection, collaboration, understanding, being seen, and seeing the other can flourish, so that we can live in a world that's filled with uncertainty and differences and still feel whole, solid, grounded, loved, and able to offer that affection and connection to others. So we're not there yet, but I hope that through our podcast, you and I are able to help some people lower the drawbridge and start the traffic back and forth across, so we can finally reconnect and form a healthier community.
Well, I think we've just got the title of this episode right. It's about lowering the drawbridge, finding opportunities for collaboration and connection. I don't know if you could have possibly known this, but when you were giving that metaphor, I was immediately transported to a trip I went on with my family to Denmark. And in a portion of the northeast part of Denmark above Copenhagen, there is a castle whose name is escaping me now. I think it might be the Kronenberg Castle. So if anybody is Danish here, please forgive me. But the the incredible thing about this Kronenberg Castle is that it's on this tiny strait between Denmark and Sweden. You just look over, right over the strait. There's Sweden. And
Mhm.
it's so close that there actually is a moat with a drawbridge to the castle on the Danish side. And I feel like the distance between that moat and that part of Denmark, and probably the distance to Sweden, isn't even all that different.
Mhm.
Um, and so, you think about something like that. You try to kind of go back in time and imagine, this theme has been playing out
Mhm.
for years, right? Well, when the drawbridge is down, you got Swedes coming over to Denmark. You got Danes coming over to Sweden. And on this theme of diversity, you've got people that maybe talk a little bit differently than you, look a little bit differently than you. Maybe they're selling goods or services that are a little bit different than what you're used to getting.
Mm-hmm.
And you get people in that mix, and what it does is it disarms the sense of threat because you've got the exposure. You're there, you're interacting. It's not dangerous. It's interesting,
Yeah,
and there are opportunities.
yeah,
And so when you were sharing that metaphor,
yeah.
one of the things I was thinking about is, diversity at times, depending on who is conveying this message. And I'm certainly not trying to be political here, but sometimes it's become like a 4-letter word. I think in the way that you're using it, it's just simply pointing out the obvious, which is that when you put that drawbridge down and you're engaging with people who are different than you in some way, it actually conversely makes you more safe.
Yeah.
But when that is seen as something kind of impinging on or a threat or coming in from the outside, people are left to their imaginations in the worst ways and they get very primitive. David, could you speak to why that happens? Like what would explain that?
I don't know that with the theme of diversity, I'm not going to say there's one way and one way only to explain that, but I'll give you an explanation. Uh, Something that our listeners or our watchers can begin practicing right away, and I'm going to introduce this first and then come back into the question that you asked. They can begin asking themselves right away today, when you're interacting with others, when you're listening to some of these messages, ask yourself, what am I missing? What am I missing? What am I not seeing? What am I not understanding? What didn't I hear? And to approach that not from the position of being poised to reject and condemn, but from the position of saying there's more here than I understand. So it's an invitation to one of your favorite subjects, which is curiosity, to explore, to lean into what you don't understand. Now, let me come back to that from a very, very old, as in millions of years old, element that gives rise to what you just said. Inside our skull, if we operate from the organ that's in the skull, the left side of the brain, we're going to look at what we don't understand from a point of view of, no, they've got the details all wrong, because we're only focused on the details. And we'll find, of course, that other people coming from different experiences will emphasize the details differently. If we're not in an environment where we feel safe and connected, those distinctions, those differences will be all that matters, and will reject whoever is voicing a different point of view. If we're operating from the right hemisphere, living inside the right half of the skull, we're going to listen to differences from a big picture perspective. And we're going to have the feeling that, no, they're missing it entirely. And it'll be this wholesale rejection, right? If all the elements of the big picture are wrong, then they must be wrong. It's only when we're able to do what evolution and time have helped us be able to do, is to flow together, to bring the details into the big picture and the big picture down into the details, that we can see and sense both the particulars and the bigger picture, both the unique differences and the big picture similarities. And I don't think we're practicing that now. So I really invite our listeners to say to themselves, I am locked into a part of this picture. What am I missing? And to cultivate a sense of curiosity, to explore, what am I not getting? How can the other that I don't understand or see or perceive actually enrich who I am, and as you said, help me feel more safe, more grounded, more able to relate with less anxiety and worry about who's coming after me or who I'm going to have to go after.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, when you were explaining this, you said a statement that totally caught my ear. You said, "There's more here than I understand." I had the great privilege this week of attending a group consultation session with an old mentor of mine that came into my group psychology practice. And in her wisdom of teaching, and I hope we'll have her on the show one day, I'll just say in her wisdom of teaching, what she said is that you could have a single phrase said a multitude of different ways that would have different meanings. So I want to focus on there's more here than I understand. Well, if said a certain way, that is an invitation. It's an invitation to discover what you don't understand with the belief that discovering that will enrich you. However, a different way of hearing that could be there's a problem. There's something that's been exposed. It could be a shame-based message that it's wrong to not understand it all. And if that's pointed out, that's dangerous. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because you talked about the two hemispheres of the brain, and you were mentioning, David, that the left side is a detail-oriented side. The right side is the big picture, right? And I could totally see when you were describing that, how, in the wrong context, somebody who has a different way of doing something is dangerous, like you were saying. But the critical piece is it safe to creatively explore what that big picture is with people who might come at it from a different point of view?
Yeah.
And so you have to feel that the endeavor of that, the understanding of what you don't know, is one that is going to benefit you, not one that's going to harm you.
Yeah. Well, I think what you and I do and have done for many decades is cultivate an ability to access a sense of safety, right?
Mm-hmm.
In order to access what's different, to hear it as you described as, oh, there's more for me to learn, we can't get there unless we're in a position where we feel relatively safe, relatively grounded, relatively secure. We'll have an episode in the future where we'll talk about different forms of attachment and connection, secure, insecure attachment patterns, and so forth. But the fundamental piece that you're mentioning is, what's the starting point? If we're going to cultivate that curiosity, what you call the special sauce, right? If we're going to cultivate that, we have to also help people feel a sense of safety and security within themselves so that they can expand from there with an attitude of curiosity so that they can move toward new discoveries. Something that I often teach, there's a certain kind of loop that happens. So through lived experience, we accumulate in the left side of our brain this massive library of accumulated experience, lived experience. It functions to help us feel that the world around us is familiar. Oh, I get it. Been there, done that. This is, I recognize. So we feel a sense of safety. But if we're confronted by things that seem different, we'll retreat into what we already know and close off the possibility of learning something new. When we learn to say, what am I missing? There's more here than meets the eye. What we do is we go from what we know now, open up to what feels new, different, and uncertain with an attitude of curiosity, so we can launch into it, make new discoveries that then loop back into updating the files, so to speak, of what we already know, making what we carry richer, wiser, deeper, and, as you said, more grounded and safe, so we can continue to practice that loop. Go from what we know to what we discover to add to what we know, expand what we know so we can feel more secure going out and discovering more. And that's true in relationships involving two people. It's true involving a relationship with ourselves, right? Hiding from ourselves gets harder if we're more willing to explore and see, be vulnerable to, all the way up to relationships at communal and societal levels. So what you described is so broadly applicable. We're going to be talking about that. In fact, in the next month or so, we'll have a guest who has expertise in just that. Do you want to introduce a little bit who may be coming down the pike?
Yeah, we're so excited to be having Dr. Carolyn Daitch come on to our show, and Carolyn and we'll have the formal introduction of Carolyn when she's actually on that episode. But Carolyn is a world-renowned expert on anxiety. She's author of many books, including the Affect Regulation Toolbox. I think it's called Anxious in Love, which is a book about anxiety and in relationships. And, Carolyn has really distilled for people in very clearly written ways, means and techniques of how you can identify, contain, soothe anxiety in your lives. We thought Carolyn would be such a great guest for our show because she really speaks to this moment in time. David, I was wondering if you could maybe share with everyone the reason why we wanted to do this episode before we had Carolyn come on.
Yeah. For me, Carolyn is going to be speaking to this problem of anxiety and worry and fear, given her expertise in all of those. But why then are Eric and I taking the time today to talk to you as we are about safety as opposed to fear? The oldest network that we are wired with is a survival network, right? Life evolved to create systems that help us stay alive. In order to stay alive, we have to detect danger. When we detect danger, the signal of that is anxiety, worry, and fear. So we are dealing with the oldest system that we have inside of us, the system that says, uh-oh, this doesn't feel right, look right, sound right, smell right. And unless, as we said earlier in our discussion today, we're grounded in an ability to stay safe and secure, we're going to be likely to start to react with some pattern of fear. Since Eric and I are people who are also quite interested in community and national and international relationships, we are both dealing personally in our families and in our clinical practices with a tremendous inflow of people who, in one way or another, are expressing the sense that this is a dangerous, horrible, frightening time to be alive. We're going down from here. I think that's an exaggeration, but we're capable of running away with those worries. So Eric and I said, let's talk today big picture. We can all identify with that, and then we're going to drill down a little bit today and more in this upcoming episode about how do we find solid ground underneath our feet so we're not constantly shadowed by terror and fear and rage and anger and anything else that goes along with living in a place of unsafety and excessive anxiety. How's that as a response to your question?
That's a great response. And when you were talking about that, what came to my mind was that the dilemma that I s- sort of hold in tension in these sessions. I wonder if this is something that you have experienced, where someone is talking to you in that way. And again, I think in these moments, David, it doesn't matter what they're saying, but they're saying something to the effect of, the other side is so dangerous, and you were not going to believe what they did. I feel like my eyes are popping out of my head right now as I'm saying this. And in that moment, right, on the one hand, we want people to feel heard and safe and seen. So you're not going in that moment to say, well, is your information factually accurate? Um,
Mhm.
so there needs to be some, whether it's implicit or explicit, sense of I'm with you. But
Mhm.
then on the other hand, right, we don't want to, in the endorsing of that, amplify and magnify this sense of fear and dis-ease in the world, because then that just amplifies it. It's worse.
So I'm going to take
Yeah,
that back into an individual experience with a client, okay?
please.
And why we call this podcast Transforming Relationships. So Eric just gave a beautiful example of the dangers of this sense of, on the one hand, not being able to hear a person who's afraid, and on the other hand, being swept away by their fear. So now there are two people who are terrified and afraid. So I remember, it's got to be 20 years ago. I was working with a woman at a time that I was consulting to a pain hospital. This woman not only had pain throughout her body, she had, to this day, the worst history of repeated abuse that I had ever been exposed to. Every cell in her body had been immersed in abusive experiences. She was a walking, talking uh, bundle of terror. Okay. So being able to manage pain was just a step in a series of much more complex steps that needed to be taken. When she came into my office and sat down, and we talked about beginning to do something to shift or alter her sense of pain, she said, "You can't. I'm in pain from head to toe. I'm always in pain. Every part of me hurts." And I was able to evoke trance by asking her to go inside and allow herself to scan as though she were separate from herself, every part of her body, looking very carefully and very closely to find any area that maybe was just a little bit less in pain than the other areas. She closed her eyes, she turned her attention inward. About 3, 4, 5 minutes later, she opened her eyes, and I still remember her saying, "Well, I guess my left earlobe doesn't hurt as much." And that was the seed of safety, of groundedness, of a difference that could make a difference, that we then worked to expand so that her sense of being safe in her own skin could grow, so that she could then move out into the world of connecting with other people in a different way. So that, in a sense, to me is a model of what we're talking about, what safety enables and what fear and anxiety prevent. We all carry within us the capacity to be different, to tap into our resourcefulness, to find other ways that are different than the dominant way we think and feel. So that's part of what Eric and I do every single day. And this podcast about transforming relationships touches on
That was such a beautiful story, to use a term from my love of hip hop. That was a mic drop worthy moment there. I feel like we could just end the show and boom. Nonetheless, I'm going to try to make a little bit more explicit some things that I immediately heard in there for our listeners and viewers. So first, just a quick precursor that you and I will be doing throughout these episodes. Anytime we convey a clinical story or anecdote, we go to great lengths to not reveal identifying information, where we can to use kind of composite descriptions. I think we might even one day do a whole episode on this of kind of just all the fascinating kind of ethical, factors that go into being two psychologists who are creating media content, and how we protect our patients' confidentiality. So that's just the first thing I wanted to name. But with regards to your specific client, the thing I really wanted to call attention to was the way you very subtly created a perspective shift. People hear the word hypnosis and they think, "Oh, okay, you're gonna wave a watch, you're gonna do something to me." But all that's really happening is we're evoking this state of being, which people go into naturally. That's why it's called trance, right, David?
Mm-hmm.
But you evoke this state, and then in just a subtle way that you make a request, and it's always permissive, is you're not saying you're going to do this. You ask a question. You give people permission to enter their lived experience in a different kind of way. And what I was really struck by was you gave that prompt. It's like you could do a scan of your body as if you were seeing the results playing out on a screen, or as if you were that machine, or as if you were that radiologist looking at it in real time. And so because for that person, that experience of living in an entirely pain-ridden body, there was no daylight there. You had to find a way to give her permission to make some daylight. And with that little glimmer, that little sliver, that's where she came up with the left earlobe. And I wanted to name that for everybody because I'm not sure if that's something people would have picked up on, but it's a critical piece of the beginnings of changing our relationships with ourselves. Because that's what, you talked about at the beginning of the show, David, the levels of relationship. That's an example of a relationship with ourselves that is fear-ridden. And so you gave her permission to have a different way of relating in that suggestion.
To pick up on that, it's important, I think, for our listeners and viewers to take away from the discussion we're having today the following. The capacity to be safe exists everywhere, even in the moments where you're convinced it doesn't. Okay? The shift is, as Eric said, a shift in perspective so that you can begin to sense, perceive what's there that you had overlooked before. Okay? That's the receptivity. That's the openness to discover something new. I remember when my boys were old enough to be umpires in Little League, right? They were playing, but they also got to be umpires. And the stands would have parents, moms and dads, who would scream when their son, it was a boys' league, didn't get the right call. And I was worried about my boys because they're getting these adults screaming at them, "Open your eyes, you're blind," or whatever else it was. What I learned is that, of course, the parents are trying to protect their kids. But what is even more interesting to me is the parents of these kids were made up of parents across the political spectrum. On any other day, they would not associate with each other. But on that day, they were united as the parents of the kids on the team. Unfortunately, it came at the expense of my kids as they were united against my boys.
And the referee.
That's right. But there is the capacity to discover, I love my son. I'm proud of my son. Oh, is that your son? Wow, he's a good hitter. He's a good runner. He's a good pitcher. And all of a sudden, all of the commonalities that make up relationship that were a few minutes or hours earlier invisible were right there. What it took was coming together to a place where they could be open to discovering something new. That's what we hope you hear. That's what we hope you can do to, if you can't see it yet, ask yourself, what am I missing? What part of the picture am I not seeing here? And to trust that if you learn to look, you're going to see, you're going to perceive, and then you can learn to act on that shift in perspective and perception.
And so it comes back to that drawbridge metaphor you were speaking to. When the drawbridge is down, or when it's even part of the way down so you can peer over to the other side, now you have opportunities to take on new perspectives, whether it's coming together in a common cause of being parents of children on a shared sports team, or as I like to think of, with a city that I have a practice in, Philadelphia. You cannot probably come up with a city that in many ways is more divided geographically, like it's literally down to the neighborhood, right?
Mm.
But every given Sunday, they are unified in their love of the Philadelphia Eagles.
Yeah.
And you see people high-fiving strangers, people who are seemingly different than them, because everybody comes together in that.
Yeah. So listen to the topics that Eric and I have talked about today. Wide-ranging topics that we've touched on. I suspect you can identify with many of them, and you can identify with our hopes and our goals of helping you learn how to utilize the transformative power of relationship in your daily lives to get to a place where you feel richer, larger, more connected, more free, more curious. That's what we're aiming for. So thank you for joining us today. We look forward to connecting with you again in an upcoming episode. Eric?
And to walk the walk that we're talking about here, we're going to come at this theme next episode with Carolyn as our guest. You know, we're going to come at it in a little bit of a different way, because Carolyn will be bringing her expertise.
Right.
So in providing that layer of experience and perspective, and new kinds of ways of entering it, we make it safer together.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you all again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Stay in touch. We'll see you next show.
As always, thank you so much for tuning in. We look forward to catching up with you again in our next episode. A quick reminder, while we are both doctors of psychology, this podcast is not a substitute for professional medical advice, does not offer diagnoses, or engage you in actual treatment. The conversations, the opinions of our guests, and any information that we share here are meant for your general knowledge, your learning, your inspiration, and your motivation to put some of our ideas into practice in your day-to-day life. Remember that everybody's body and everybody's personal health journey is different, so what works for one person may not be right for the next or for you. If you have questions about your health, any psychological or medical condition, or any changes that you're thinking about making to your lifestyle, your diet, your exercise routine, your medications, or some other aspect of your life, it's always best to talk with a qualified healthcare professional who knows your personal history. Never ignore or delay professional advice because of something you heard here with us. We want you to enjoy the show and to walk away with useful insights, but ultimately, you are responsible for your own health decisions. Please use your best judgment, stay curious, and always listen to your body. Take care, be well,